Welcome to the second module of Using Vue with ASP.NET Core by Example. This module will talk about some Vue basics. We're going to start by showing you declarative rendering, then we'll dive into filters, list binding, event binding, attribute binding, and then we'll talk about the Vue instance lifecycle. So one of the first things you're going to learn how to do in Vue is data binding. Now I want to talk a little bit about how the data binding actually works. When you set up data properties inside of Vue, it actually attaches a getter and a setter to each property. When it does this, it registers a dependency to something called a watcher, which we'll talk about a lot later. But this idea of a watcher is a piece of code that's waiting for some change to happen. And that when data binding happens, the virtual DOM will simply read the getter of that data property in order to show it in the DOM. When something touches the data or makes a change to data, that setter is activated and alerts and notifies the watcher itself that a change has happened. Then the watcher will tell the virtual DOM to update itself next time it goes through a render cycle. This is not happening immediately, but on a timed render update. These are happening so quick, you're probably not going to notice these, but I want you to understand some of these terms before we start digging into how the data binding actually works. So let's start by talking about the declarative binding. So if we return where we ended, which was in the index.cs HTML file, you remember we created this instance of the Vue here directly in a script block. But of course, we're never going to want to really do that. Instead, we're going to want to create a script in JavaScript, and I'm just going to call it indexpage.js. So we're going to need this indexpage.js. So let's open up www.root and just create a new JavaScript file here. I'll call it indexpage.js. But what you call it is not important. And we'll do like we did before. We'll create a new instance of Vue. I'll start with an options object inside of it and set up that the element we want is based on the selector of index page. We remember back here, we have this index page as a section of the page that we want Vue to be responsible for. So that's how we got this element of index page. Just like we had done before directly on the page, but we're going to be doing more work here. We don't want to put it directly inside the CS HTML page. The second property we're going to be interested in here is one called data. Data takes an arbitrary object that represents the data that you're going to expose to the Vue. So if I just put something like app name, and I'll call this the store, then I'll be able to refer to app name inside of the Vue. So you remember we put in the year here with those double curly braces back in module 1. Let's go ahead and instead of saying products here, let's just say app name. So what ends up being exposed to the object here is the object that is assigned to the data part of the Vue. So we don't need the word data in there. It assumes that it's going to be the root object that we're going to be able to access here. So if we refresh this page, we can now see that the store is showing up here as the name of the app. We're still getting separately that 2018, but we're going to remove that in a moment. If we come in here and change this to product list, and just go and refresh, we'll see we're getting that bound in this one-way binding directly onto our page. You can also have complex objects here. Like here, I'll create an object called product that is just another embedded object. And so here I'm just putting together a simple brand or simple name, a simple category, and then even a string that represents some URL. And then down here, all we need to do is go ahead and craft up what we actually want here. So let's start with a h3 product.brand. So we're using this syntax because the product is what's directly on the data, and then whatever is after it is just JavaScript extensions of calling properties, or you could use this to call functions as well. Really is whatever you want to do at that point that's inside that data. Now, if we look at this now, we can see that Sean's stuff is now showing up there. And let's go ahead, since it's the same size as the product, let's go ahead and make it an H3 instead, and let's add some other parts of the product. So there's our category and there's our name. And we're using some Bootstrap in order to change the way this looks, but that should be pretty good. Back here in our design, we can now see this starting to be put together. There's the brand, there's the name of the product, and this is the category of the product. Let's wrap all this in a div, and we'll just put it in a class called info. And we'll do a couple of things here to make it a little pretty. I'm going to start with a card, which is a Bootstrap 4 mechanic, if you're not that familiar with it. And I'll just change this from card to just card body. And I'll change this from note class to saying card title. And we can see this start to be put together in the Bootstrap idea of a card. And now let's create a div with the class of card footer. And here we can just create 2 buttons. And again, I'm using these classes from Bootstrap 4, so I'm going to make some assumption you've had some exposure. Otherwise, just copy what I'm doing based on the example code. Now that we've added these buttons on the bottom, you can see that we have a block for our product, have buy and about, and let's go ahead and add the price. And notice that we can do this one-way binding and mix it with arbitrary text. We don't need to be doing inline concatenation of text at all. We can just throw this in the middle of any part of the HTML. So we want to be able to show a price here, but if you remember back in our object, we didn't have a price. So let's go ahead and add a dummy price here, and let's say this is going to be $12.99. Just put the plain old number in there. If we show this now, because we can add these arbitrary types, we'll see we're getting a price of $2.99. We'd like to be able to format that a little better and decide exactly how big or how small it is. Let's do that next with the concept of filters. So now let's talk about filters. If we come back to our data and let's add a property called today, and I'm just going to say new date. Just today's date that we can show on the page. Remember, we have this new date up here, but let's replace this with just today so that we're getting it from the Vue data block itself. And I'll just shorten this up a little. If we refresh our page, we can now see that today is what? Now, as developers, we can kind of sense what this is. This is probably the part that's the date. This is the part that's the time. So we'd like to be able to format that. And we can certainly do this because it is just JavaScript. We could say toDate string, and we'll get that lovely date string, but that's not very uniform or reusable. What we'd prefer to do is use something called a filter. The idea behind filters is when you're doing this data binding, we want to be able to use the pipe and then put the name of some reusable filter. And in our case, I'm going to say date. Now, Vue itself, in order to maintain itself as small, doesn't have any built-in filters. If we go out to Vue and go to the ecosystem, we can see that there is this system of curated projects. We can actually look at filters here, and it's going to say no packages found, but if we look at browse more packages, this will actually take us to a larger list that is maintained on GitHub. And in this awesome view, one of the types it has is for filters, and these are filter packs you could download for some very standard filters. The Vue 2 filters is one that I've used a couple of times because it has a lot of built-in filters for you to use out of the box. But instead of actually using any of those, we're going to build our own. We're going to build one called date. So if we come back to our object, we can add a new section to our view called filters. And filters is going to allow us to create named filters, and a filter is just a function. That filter is going to take some value and then return the filtered version of it. So in this case, we'll just say value to date string. Now, we could, of course, be checking to make sure this is a date, or we could be using TypeScript later to ensure it's a date. But for now, that's good enough. So that if we show this date here as just the name of the filter for today, and we refresh, we'll see that it is going to show that exactly the way we want. In that same way, we can take this product price and create a filter for, let's say, money. Right? Not a very smart money function, but a money function that'll work. If we look at this now, it puts that magic $sign in the beginning. So this seems kind of a one-off, why we would need to build these filters on every view we're going to be building. We could actually create our own JavaScript file for our filters, and then make sure on the index.cshtml that we're going to include them, so that this way we can create a set of filters that are reusable, so that on different pages we could reuse our set of filters that matter to us. And the way we do that is interesting. The Vue object itself has several APIs that we're going to be using, and the first one is called filter. Filter simply takes a named filter. Let's come down here, and I'm just going to borrow these filters. And because we're not going to create any that are one-offs on our view, we're going to create them in here. I'll just paste these over here so I have a way to get at them. And I'm going to put this in filter. So the first argument of filter is the name of the filter itself, the global filter. That second parameter is just that same function that we built before. And so if we have more than one, we just need to call it again. So now that we have these, we don't have to reference them anywhere in our view. By attaching them to the Vue object itself, we'll be able to just use them any place we want. So if we refresh it, now that we're getting that filters.js, we can see that the filters are still working. But sometimes filters aren't this simple, where we just want to filter it in some magical, special way. So let's go to our filter here for money, and let's add a new parameter for decimal places. Just a new parameter into our function, and then we can say to fixed decimal places. Now, we can't really say that this is going to be required, so let's just say if decimal places equals undefined, so it wasn't actually sent to us, then let's say decimal places equals 2. So we're just going to default it there, so that it should just continue to work like it did before, because we're not supplying the second parameter. So we come back here and say money 0, for example, and refresh, we'll see we're getting the version that has 0 decimal places. We're relying on this parameter, let's say 4, to be passed through to the filter. In addition, we could do the same thing. Let's leave it at 2 and let's put in the pound symbol. So we're passing in 2 parameters in this case. And so over in the filters, we're just going to add another. Let's call it a symbol. The symbol is undefined. Then symbol equals. And hopefully, if I've done this right, we should get a pound sign now. So that lets us define or decide what we want to do with filtering. We can create simple or complex filters. We can create them one-off or make them reusable, or even create our own module that adds all of these things at once. And we'll get to modules a little later in the course. Let's move on to list binding. So now let's talk about list binding. I'm going to go back to our Vue instance here, and instead of having product here, I'm going to replace it with a list of products. So we now have a property on the data called products, and this is going to contain 3 products that we can actually bind to. They have the same shape as we had before. There's just now 3 of them or 5 of them, or you can craft up a lot of them if you want. So we can take our card the way it sits here, and we can use it almost in the same way. But we're going to start it and wrap it with a div. And this div is going to use a syntax called for. So there's a number of attributes inside of Vue that allow you to do certain things, and we're going to be looking at a number of them, but v4 is one of the first one you'll see. v4 says, I want to create a binding to a collection I have. So much like a for statement inside of JavaScript or C#, you're going to be able to say for product in products. So products is the data.property that represents a list, and then we're going to create an instance called product for each one that's in that list. And I named it product so that we could go ahead and use these same names. I could certainly have shortened this to P and then change all of these to P as well. The idea here is that it's simply an alias for that instance of our product. Now, when this actually executes, this div is going to be generated for each section. So we can go ahead and add a class here to use 3 columns wide. The column MD4 is a Bootstrap convention. Again, if you're not that familiar with Bootstrap, something you could certainly take a look at, but it's just a way for us to take this card and show 3 of them across on a page. And then I'm going to wrap this whole thing into something called a row, which is also a convention from Bootstrap. And if I've done this right, we should now see that we have the 3 paper products from Sean's stuff, but that Magic Writing Paper, Magic Writing Paper 2, and Magic Writing Paper 3 all exist now with different prices. And the idea here is that we're able to take a simple list and then bind it to create a more complex list of products in this case. That we're binding to this collection, then allowing the code here, the data binding, to actually build up the items on the page for us. Well, in reality, you're never going to really hard code a list like we have here, though you could certainly do that using some razor tricks. More likely, you're going to call an API like we'll do a little later on in the course. One of the things we haven't actually shown yet is showing an image. So let's go ahead and add an image here, and let's use that basic syntax we were looking at earlier for p.image_url. By putting the product image in here, we should be able to just show an image on each one of these. But of course, it shows a broken link. And the reason is it thinks that the image URL itself is this string. We're not telling Vue that we know about this inside of this attribute. And we're going to be digging a little further into attribute syntax, but let me talk about how this actually works as it relates to what we're doing here. We can actually use another Vue construct called vbind to say, hey, we want to bind this attribute to what is in the contents of this. So we don't need to pollute this with the double curly brace. We can actually just put p_url in here because vbind is going to tell Vue, hey, I want you to look in this attribute and figure out what to actually put in this attribute for us. And if we look at this now, we'll see that it's showing 3 images that actually don't exist, but that's fine. It's actually pulling in an image that says no image. And showing or not showing an image here may or may not be interesting or important. What we can actually do here is add another construct called vif. This is going to allow us to hide the image in case we don't have a good image here. So we could say vif p.image URL, just do a true or false on the image URL. But of course, these have image URL, so it's not going to be showing it. So instead, we'll just use some JavaScriptness here to say index of no image. And of course, we get into our embedded quote problem is greater than -1. So effectively, if it finds that the image URL has no image in the phrase at all, though this might be a little fragile, it'll hide the image. We can see this by just refreshing this. So we're showing the no image, even though in the code we're checking for a no image. And that's because this phrase, this statement, needs to be true if we're going to show the image. And of course, this is only showing the image if it says no image. So we'll just change this to show the image if no image isn't found. When we do that, press F5 to refresh, and they disappear. Later on, when we're getting real products, we'll see them reappear if we have a good image on the product list. So next, let's talk about binding to events. So let's talk about event binding next. So we'd like to be able to deal with these buy buttons to actually do something. Now these could be URLs to another page if that's really what you want, and that's likely what we're going to eventually do with the about buttons. But for the buy, what we'd like to do is actually handle the event when the buy button's clicked. And we can do that with the directive called von. Von is going to have us say von : and then the name of the event handler to handle. In this case, that is click. And then I'm just going to say on buy. And notice I'm not giving it the name of the event, but the actual JavaScript we want to run. And that'll become more important as we go on. Over in the index page, let's add a new section called methods. Methods are callable functions that you want. Instead of just liberally putting arbitrary names anywhere in this object, they're going to want you to actually create an object called methods that has each of these functions. And there's some reasons they want this level of ceremony, but it's not a lot of ceremony, so we should be good. So I'm just going to say on buy, and it's going to be a function. And I'll just use an alert to go buying to make sure that we can see this actually being called. We refresh the page and we click buy, we can now see that the buying is called. Of course, the alert, so it's giving us a chance to stop dialogues from being created because people can use it in an annoying fashion. But popping up an alert isn't as interesting. What I'd love to have is the product that we're buying. So let's change this simply to say product.name. If we refresh this again and click buy, nothing's going to happen because we don't know what that product actually is being sent. In fact, this is failing to shoot the alert because product is unknown. But back in our index.cshtml, let's just put p there. Why P? Well, if you remember, this is inside of the v4 products, and P is the alias for the product that we're binding to. So even though this is going to be repeated, this on buy will include the P that represents the product in that card. So now, when we press buy, the product that we're being shown on the page is actually going to be showing that. Magic Writing Paper, Magic Writing Paper 3. So it's an actual instance of the object here. And what's interesting is this lifetime of the object that's being sent, we can actually change. So let's add a couple of things that we're going to delete in a moment because we don't really need it, but to sort of hammer this idea home. So before the row, let's add a new button here, and I'll just call it add, and I'm gonna have a on click that says add product. This doesn't make any sense in the sense of what we want to do, but we'll create a temporary little function called add product. Now, one trick you'll find here is this v-on has a shortened version of this. You can actually just say at click, but of course we're inside of a razor page, so at is a reserved character. It assumes that at is going to be the beginning of some razor syntax. So inside razor we actually have to use two ats, and that's more of a razor thing than a Vue thing, but just so you to be aware in ASP.NET, that's going to be an important idea here. Now, there's no benefit in not doing v-on click, but if you want to have the shortened version, it's a little easier to type just double at click when you're working inside of a HTML page. So inside the methods, we'll also create an add product as a function, and I'm going to say this.products. Now, the this.products is interesting because what happens when these methods are called is that this function pointer is being bound to a this that represents the data. The this doesn't represent the VM here, but actually the data that we're going to be interacting with. So I'm just going to push a new product on the list, and I'll just call it, I'm not going to fill in all of these. I'll just make them $1. And let's go ahead and put category in here as well. Let's go ahead and include an URL here of just a no image. That'll be good enough. So every time we click that button, it's going to call add product, and it's just going to create a new product. It's creating a new product and pushing it onto the list of products. This is where that idea that the bindings we're dealing with are actually a live instance. So let's refresh this to get that add button. And what happens when we add a new one? It actually extends the list of objects. In fact, if we call by, we still get that same behavior of by still works against the object that it's being dealt with. And so we're starting to get a sniff of the idea that these are live objects that we're going to be dealing with, and that the bindings are going to react to them. Not just show them the first time, but in fact react to them as we make changes to them. So let's just undo that little piece. In fact, I'll just leave it, because we're going to be seeing how that part of it works a lot better later on. Let's get rid of this add button so we're not confused by it, but that we can see this basic nature of a live set of data that we're dealing with is an important one. Let's take a look at attribute binding next. So now let's talk about attribute binding. We saw here in the image that we have this attribute binding syntax here that basically says, take this value and put it in whatever is after the colon for the binding name. And the trick of it is you actually don't need vbind here. You can just use the colon itself as a shortcut to say this is binding versus worrying about what's inside the quotes at all. By having to put this colon or even the vbind before, we're telling Vue to not have to worry about parsing and looking at every attribute, because most attributes are ones that you're not going to be using binding in. Let's show you a more obvious example. Let's come up to this card, and we might want to add a class based on some data. So in the index page, let's go ahead and just add on sale true, and we'll make the other ones of these false. So we now have a new property on each of the products, and then we'd like to be able to make some change here when the card is on sale. We just put BG secondary in the card. We'll actually see that it adds this subtle gray background to it. We'd like this to be programmatic, so instead of putting secondary there, what we can do is we can say vbind to class, and we'll see that class, unlike the source, is a little different in that it's going to take an object. That object is going to take the name of the class we want to assign, one or more, and then the value that it's going to test against. So in this case, we're going to want to say BG secondary, and the value is going to be on sale. In fact, it's going to be P on sale because we're checking the on sale of the actual product. We refresh the page, we'll see that the sale products now have the gray background versus the other. And this is an important idea here because we're telling it to add a class name if some value is true. So if we come back here and change the last item to on sale equals true and refresh, we'll see that it also gets that change. So the different kinds of binding properties can really change the way that you actually need to do the bindings. Class is one that you're going to use quite a lot, but it's going to allow you to do some very interesting, non-traditional things. You could think about the background as being something that is not really about the business logic at all. And this is one of the reasons I like the separation of the view and how you're going to display it and the actual data like we have in the JavaScript. So this is telling me that I want to be able to show the sale product, and then the person responsible for doing this design work may or may not be the same person, can make the decision about how to do that. So instead of v-binding the class here, they might want to go ahead and bind to the class here and say tech success p on sale. In this case, it'll bind to the class of just the price line based on whether it's on sale or not. So we can see we're not only making the background, but we're also making the price be green. So we can make these decisions about exactly how we want to do this. For the most part, when you're making these changes, I'm using some of the built-in Bootstrap classes. You could also add it to your own CSS so you can bind to those classes. Though this is true for all of the different kinds of attributes. So next, let's look at the lifecycle of the Vue object itself. Next, let's talk about what the Vue lifecycle exactly is. So we look at the Vue object itself. I've told you that there's a data element and a methods element. There's also several more that talk about the lifecycle of the page. The first one that you'll want to know about is created. This is like a constructor of some sense with the Vue. This says, here is a function I want you to call once the Vue object itself has been created. And so we could simply come in here and say, should call the API eventually, right? We'll just, once the Vue object is created, we'll call this alert. Now the important part about this is if we refresh this, we'll see created is happening even before the data binding is happening. So it's happening really quickly or really early in the life cycle of the page. So instead of created, we could change this to mounted. And if we refresh, we'll see that this is called after the page has actually successfully been bound. Inside the documentation, we can see that there's these options for lifestyle hooks. These are all events that can be handled that are about the life cycle of your Vue object. So before create and created, before mount and mounted, before update and updated. And that's something that happens every time the view is rendered, deactivated, destroyed, before destroy, and then error captured. These are all lifestyle hooks that you can actually get into. Now I find in most Vue applications, created or mounted, I tend to use even them sparingly. I've never actually had to use any of the others. But you could certainly see that deactivated or destroyed are ones that you might want to use to do some cleanup work eventually. The other idea here, and one we're going to use quite a lot, is a pattern I like to do, which is to show errors on the page. So here I have an error, and I'm just assigning it an empty string because we're going to assume we're going to start without some error condition. And then I could do a div with an alert, danger, and here I could just say error. The alert and alert danger are, again, Bootstrap conventions to create a look and the feel of an actual little error block. And if we refresh the page, we're seeing this error block show up, but there's no text in it. So we might want to go ahead and use a if as well to just say if error is false. So if it's empty or if it's actually undefined, don't show it. Otherwise, go ahead and show it. Remember, this is a true condition that if error is not null, we're going to go ahead and show the error. And so here in our page, we're seeing it not appear at all. It's not actually in the DOM. But here in mounted, if we just actually set error equal, you must call the API, it's not built yet, right? We're setting a property. We're asking that if to be executed as soon as we're mounted. Now we're seeing the alert show up. There's our little block of text. If we wanted to clear the error, we could certainly do that as well. And so we're starting to talk about bindings that are not only the data, like the stuff that's in here, but also ones that are about running the individual page. So you can see wait cursors might be like that, errors might be like that, other things that are about the housekeeping of the actual view. So you're going to want to have the view that has data that is a mix of these pieces, both pieces that are going to run the page as well as the actual data that's interacted on the page. Because remember, we're talking about building pages at this point that are making some part of your application more reactive to the user. We're not talking about building full spas yet. We're going to do that in later modules, but there's many cases where I find that I just want to make this page interactive without having a lot of postbacks and showing new pages and trying to save data on the server and all of that stuff that adds to some of the complexity of building these things. And I just want to have an interactive page, and that's what we're starting to do here. Let's wrap up this module. So we've talked about Vue basics. I've talked about the declarative binding that is so central to the way that Vue works. I've also shown you that the data that's living inside of your Vue is live and has to be treated that way, so that you want to tie your data to your binding, both for the actual data that your user needs to interact with in some way, but also the housekeeping properties that are about a lot of the pages that you're going to build. Let's move on to Module 3.